We come to the section now where we want to talk about how to counsel. But what we really want to do is not necessarily get into the details of how to counsel as you have been reading in your work. We want to look at how to use the framework and doing a case and use that as our aspect of counseling. Because as you are having to work through this for a paper and you're going to have to do it on the final exam, I wanted to take time to just kind of help you walk through how to think about the framework as far as the words to use and then how to actually work it out through a case, which eventually will move hopefully into you doing counseling. So let's walk through some things, and I want you to begin to think about these words and how we will begin to articulate the framework aspect of counseling, or how we talk counseling, if you will, using framework terminology. Let me read this to you. It says, the following is a list of ways in which a lack of love, guilt, a sense of guilt, uncaused fear, and uncaused fleeing tend to be expressed or demonstrated in everyday life situations. As we continue in our studies, we will begin to use this terminology to explain how a lack of love, sense of guilt, uncaused fear, and uncaused fleeing is being demonstrated in a person's life or in some case we will study. For instance, here's what we'll begin to say. We'll say this is an expression or demonstration of uncaused fleeing. So we've been talking about apparent uncaused fleeing. We've been talking about AU fear, apparent uncaused fear, and the sense of guilt. But we want to show you what it looks like in real time. And so you'll make statements like, this is a demonstration or an expression of apparently uncaused fleeing. Or you will say, this is an expression or demonstration of uncaused fear. Or you will say, this is an expression or demonstration of a sense of guilt. Or you will say, this is an expression or demonstration of a lack of love. What this means is that one of the elements of the framework is being expressed or demonstrated. Now, notice I started backwards, because when you do real counseling, people are not going to, most of the time, unfold what their lack of love issue is. They're going to talk about byproducts of a lack of love. They're going to talk about many expressions of AU fleeing and many expressions of apparent uncaused fear and many expressions of a sense of guilt. And as you learn what those things look like, you're going to make a connection to say, if I see an expression of AU fleeing, if I see an expression of a sense of guilt, if I see an expression of apparent uncaused fear, let me do it in the order, apparent uncaused fleeing, apparent uncaused fear, sense of guilt. If I see any of those expressions, then I know that the root cause is a lack of love for God and a lack of love for others. And so our goal is to help you understand this framework and then pull all these pieces of the puzzle together. So let me give you some examples of what a lack of love may look like, if you will. It may be demonstrated in things such as this: impatience, irritability, annoyance, anger, rage, cruelty, unkindness, jealousy, envy, enmity, hostility, hatred, bragging, pride, conceit, immorality, impurity, indecency, criminality, thoughtlessness, greed, selfishness, stubbornness, obstinacy, self-centeredness, grumbling, thanklessness, discontentment, resentment, grudge-bearing, unforgiveness, bitterness, maliciousness, suspicion, pessimism, or hopelessness. And again, that's not all of it, but these are some of the basic ways when a person is walking in a lack of love for God and others is being demonstrated. And again, remember, lack of love is sin. Sin is a lack of love. So when someone experiences expressions of AU fleeing, apparently uncaused fear, or a sense of guilt, that means that somewhere in their life they have been walking in a lack of love for God and a lack of love for others, because those things, sense of guilt, AU fear, AU fleeing, are a byproduct of one walking in a lack of love for God and others. So we know that when we see any of those things being demonstrated, that the root cause is a lack of love for God and a lack of love for others. And so these are just some of the basic expressions of a lack of love for God and others. Now, let's look at some of the basic expressions of a sense of guilt. In other words, when a sense of guilt is being expressed or demonstrated, this is what we're going to see. We'll see someone feeling guilty, or they'll have a sense of condemnation, or there'll be an anticipation of punishment, or they'll have a bothered conscience, or they will be having accusing thoughts, or they'll be down on themselves, or they'll have low self-respect, if you will, or a sense of worthlessness, or self-condemnation, or an excessive doubt about doing something. If you see any of these things being expressed, then that person is demonstrating a sense of guilt. And if they're demonstrating a sense of guilt, you know that that's not their main problem. That is a byproduct of the root problem, which is a lack of love for God and others, which means that there is a specific sin issue or specific way they're walking in a lack of love for God and others that's producing this sense of guilt that's being demonstrated. So when I see a sense of guilt in any one of these ways, that's not my main problem. That's the indication that I'm not dealing with a lack of love towards God and others in my life. Let's take a look at what apparently uncaused fear looks like or can be expressed in. Anxiety, uneasiness, apprehension, dread, tension, restlessness, excessive worry, anticipation of misfortune, danger or doom, irritability, overdependence, timidity, shyness, panic, terror, overconcern, hyper happiness, imagination of illness, agitation, overactivity, easy distraction, persecution complex. These are just some of the ways that apparently uncaused fear will demonstrate itself. Now, what's interesting is this. What apparently uncaused fear is not being addressed because one is not dealing with the root, which is a lack of love towards God and others. The apparently uncaused fear can move from immaterial ways of demonstrating themselves to beginning to affect the body, and you start to see some physiological effects. So let me read this to you. When uncaused fear continues, it may begin to affect the body. As a result, one may begin to experience some physiological effects on the body because one is not dealing with their sin. It's kind of like what we saw in Psalm 32 when David said, "When I kept quiet about my sin, my body wasted away." So there are some times where when we're experiencing apparently uncaused fear, it can have such a major impact that it starts to impact us physiologically. Now, this doesn't mean that anytime we see these physical things that there's always apparent uncaused fear. But what we are saying is sometimes if you see some of these physiological effects, it could be the byproduct of apparently uncaused fear. And what you do is you have a person go to a doctor. The doctor signs off and says, "Hey, we can't find any reason for this biologically. You need to see a therapist." And then we know, no, they don't need to see a therapist. We know that these physiological effects are the outworking of apparently uncaused fear in the immaterial heart. Let me give you some examples of some physiological things that could occur as a result of apparently uncaused fear happening in one's heart. Hyper alert, fidgety, talking too much, falling asleep, impaired concentration, poor memory, excessive perspiration, muscle tension, headaches, sighing respirations, hyperventilation, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea, butterflies, high blood pressure, rapid heartbeat, fainting episodes, frequent urination, impotence, frigidity, ulcers, nervous stomach, depletion of brain chemicals, hormone irregularities, weakened immune system. These are things that, if they're being demonstrated, possibly could be a physiological effect of apparently uncaused fear, which means that the person has a sense of guilt happening, which is what's producing the apparent uncaused fear, which means that at the root, the byproduct or the root of all of this is a lack of love for God and a lack of love for others. Now, let me share with you some ways that apparently uncaused fleeing is expressed. And uncaused fleeing may be expressed in a lot of different ways, and I want you to see some of them. Withdrawal, isolation, escape, inner hiding, denial, defensiveness, excessive self-protection, abandonment or denial of self-evident truth, escape from reality, withdrawal of intimacy, embracing fantasy as reality, pursuit of imaginary states, desperation to flood one's mind with stimuli, desperation to flood one's body with stimuli, anesthetizing one's brain, unwillingness to be open, living in a fantasy world, unwillingness to reason, delusions, blaming, self-justification, changing the subject, trying to get rid of another person, criticizing others about the sin while denying the same sin in ourselves, trying to live properly without dealing with our sin. These are ways that people tend to express apparently uncaused fleeing. If I see apparently uncaused fleeing, that means that at the root there's a lack of love. But if we trace it back specifically, apparently uncaused fleeing comes because a person is experiencing apparently uncaused fear. Apparently uncaused fear is happening because the person is experiencing a sense of guilt. And the sense of guilt is coming because of a lack of love towards God and a lack of love towards others, and or a lack of love towards others. So here's what we know. If I see any of those things, then I know that at the end of the day, the root cause is a lack of love for God and a lack of love for others. And as we discover what that lack of love is specifically, we get the person to confess it, to count on God's forgiveness, and to be controlled by the Holy Spirit and count on control, which means they begin to walk in the loving thing towards God and others to overcome the lack of love towards God and others, which will lead them to experience the peace of God, a confidence before God, and a desire to draw near. So, as we look at this, I want to encourage you to think about these matters, and in the next session, we will talk about how to put this to practice in a case.